I'm happy to be here with you today. My presentation for the Juanita Brooks 2020 lecture is Constructing Zion, Faith, Grit, and the Realm of Possibilities. Italo Calvino in Invisible Cities portrays a series of conversations between Marco Polo and Kubla Khan, which reveal the complex intersection between real cities that we build and those that are imagined and exist only in the mind. Having traveled much of the world, Polo spins tales of grand and exotic cities. As he speaks, these cities begin to sound like each other, and even like places Khan has himself visited or imagined. Khan pushes his colleague, asking, are these cities real? And then he describes the city from his own imagination. The line between reality and fantasy became incredibly confused. And once again, Khan's city is strikingly similar to one Polo has described. Khan asks Polo to name the city, and Polo responds, "It has neither name nor place. I shall repeat the reason why I was describing it to you. From the number of imaginable cities, we must exclude those whose elements are assembled without a connecting thread, an inner rule, a perspective, a discourse. With cities, as it is with dreams, everything imaginable can be dreamed. But even the most unexpected dream is a rebus that conceals the desire, or in its reverse, a fear. Cities like dreams are made of desires and fears, even if the thread of their discourse is secret, their rules are absurd, and their perspectives deceitful, and everything conceals something else." Zion, for the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, embodied both a desire for heaven and a profound fear of the alternative. This study seeks to understand the imaginative spaces of the Latter-day Saint world, and I'll use a single city block and its environment as a metaphor for core concepts that drove the construction of architecture, city spaces, and what the Mormons called Zion, which implied both places and ideas. Block 88 in Salt Lake City displays the Mormon blueprint for the Good Society for Zion. Located in the metaphoric rather than the actual center of the city, it represents a series of templates for the perfect world as sketched out by the Latter-day Saints during the 19th century through the theoretical Plat of the city of Zion. The Plat, like Polo's imagined city, represented the hope for a better way of being in the world. It was an imagined utopian dream space that materialized in part in more than 400 rural towns in the Great Basin area. This paper seeks meaning in the space at the center of Salt Lake City, beginning with an introduction to space theory and American planning history. The Plat of the city of Zion as a template for settlement was applied in a particular way in Salt Lake City. Block 88, the block immediately to the east of Temple Square, illuminates Brigham Young's ideas about family kingdom and the LDS Church's concepts about the components of a good and meaningful life. The analytical categories about space presented in Henri Lefebvre's seminal work, The Production of Space, including the perceived, the conceived, and the lived, inform this study. Lefebvre recommends an approach he calls spaciology that identifies the link between physical space or natural space and mental space or formal abstractions about space, the core concepts that generate form with social space, which is the space of human action, conflict, and sensory phenomenon. The community building efforts of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the 19th century reveal a series of conceptual maps, the idea of Zion, the interpretation of sacred space, and particular ideas about family and kingdom. Their millennial expectations heightened the significance of building efforts on the earth. They felt obligated to construct a world that would be pleasing to God, and the resulting concepts about space and literal spaces, reflected ideas about community, about gender, about theology, about religious authority. Kitty corner from the most sacred space, the LDS temple, was the bishop's storehouse, or the profane areas of the barns of the Brigham Young family complex, a visual and social paradox that played out in the spaces of the city. When the Latter-day Saints built towns, they constructed space that contained a sacred narrative. The Mormon experience played out in the context of the 19th century American landscape. The motto set with the Puritan city upon a hill ran through 19th century America, and it inspired countless dreams of a new world, a world of the imagination, no different from the one portrayed by Polo in Calvino's story. Endless miles of forests met pioneers carving their way through mountain ranges and valleys in between. Prairies stretched to the edge of the sky and beyond. Bodies of water, dark and raging through canyons or near the land's edge, threatened destruction. The complex American landscape formed the backdrop to numerous utopian experiments. Efforts to build Zion by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints exemplify this phenomenon. When the Latter-day Saints built towns, they were conceiving, constructing, and practicing social space. The place-based Latter-day Saint version of the ideal society was positioned in the historical context of American town building more broadly. Previous attachments, assumptions, and traditions colored attempts at designing something new. As important as their hopes for a future world were memories of the past. Historian Sylvia Dowdy Fries suggests in her book, The Urban Idea in Colonial America, that this has always been true of the story of American cities. And she writes, the symbolic American landscape has included not only the Edenic garden, but also the New Jerusalem. The idea of the American city originated in an aggregate of social, religious, economic, and political forces, along with the aspirations of human beings for a better world. John W. Reps and Anthony B. Garvin, among others, has traced the underlying conceptions that sometimes produce plans that look similar, a kind of lineage of the idea and form of the city in the New World. The grid plan, for instance, in Philadelphia, formed a precedent for an endless stream of American towns laid out orthogonally. Most of the founding cities of the American experiment were planned in terms of their physical appearance, as well as social organization before actual settlement took place. Woven through the narrative of the Latter-day Saint attempt to build yet another new world were purely American attitudes which conceived of an experimental landscape seeking the pattern for perfect living. Fries ties this to the act of remembering, and she argues, quote, no less important to the new environments, to the formation of society, and especially of its self-perception, is the role of memory and expectations formed of the past. In the, end quote, in the conceptualization and construction of new places, Frederick Jackson Turner argued that the frontier created a new type of individual and democratic ways of being together in community. But equally significant, city building included the creation of political systems that distinguished the American landscape from that of Europe. The American city was the primary setting of the representation of imagination and was a social construction indigenous to the country. As Fries argues, quote, what we say can not only be equated with what we make, but alone adequately mirrors our conception of the world, unquote. In 1883, the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith presented a revelation to his people called the Plat of the City of Zion. The Plat outlined a template for the settlement of cities dedicated to God, what the Mormons would call Zion. And each town was to be laid out according to the cardinal points of the compass, north, south, east, and west, and proceed outward from a central square, the center of the Mormon world. Blocks were to be 10 acres, each with individual lots at a half acre. The city of Zion would grow to more than 20,000 residents before the church would build another, and in this way spread the Mormon way of being in the world across the Western United States. The Plat of the City of Zion was both a map drawn by Frederick G. Williams with notes in the margins describing the way it would be built, and a set of instructions about how to build cities that would be the setting for a religious drama. Moreover, the Mormon grid plan reflected the most characteristic American town planning gesture, according to John Reps, who says, the widespread use of the gridiron or checkerboard pattern, unquote, was the single most important plan used throughout the American West. He argues convincingly that the grid was the quintessential pattern for American town building, regardless of where they appeared. The Mormon effort to build regular cities dedicated to God was firmly rooted in American traditions of urban planning. And settlers during the colonial and frontier eras laid out cities and towns with straight streets meeting at right angles in geometric rectangular blocks. The Plat of the City of Zion resembled Philadelphia and Savannah's plans with their gridded systems of town squares and surrounding streets. The Mormon cities of Zion exemplified a preference for order and visible and tangible patterns of streets laid out without regard to geography, diversity, or sometimes even convenience. Richard Wade points to the practical advantages of the grid, which simplified the problems of surveying and minimized legal disputes over lot boundaries. It also gave at least the illusion of orderliness, which settlers associated with cities they had known in the East, Wade suggests in his book. But he also says the regularity ran deeper than that and represents the dominance of human beings over nature. For example, straight lines rather than curved ones demonstrated the difference between the city and the country. Fries suggests the power of the new American city was in the search for order, which was the psychological accompaniment of the experience of dislocation shared by English men and women who, with a variety of purposes, ventured into the American wilderness. This power was real in Massachusetts Bay Colony in the early 18th century and Zion building in the middle of the 19th century. But the legacy of colonial cities was the more general one of a concern for the formal modeling of open spaces into complementary geometric forms which characterized the architectural attitudes of their designers, according to Fries. Joseph Smith packed his anecdote to the experience of dislocation in the rhetoric of revelation. In 1833, the Mormon prophet gave his people a pattern for settlement, which he called the Plat of the City of Zion. And the Plat mapped the Mormon world wherever the Latter-day Saints constructed them, laying out towns and connections and commandments. It delineated boundaries deep as chasms that surrounded insiders and identified outsiders. In practice, the movements of the city's inhabitants defined what this meant in the space of Salt Lake City. In a complicated dance, pioneer men and women inhabited space and gave it a new meaning. Importantly, their lives consecrated the land and dedicated it to God. Salt Lake City was a sacred city made meaningful through a web of relationships that created a pattern of being on the earth and a physical connection to that of the heavens. From the 1830s, this venture at building the city of God had heightened significance for the Mormon saints. And for them, it was Zion, the fulfillment of prophecy, and proof positive that they were a righteous people obeying God's will. Specific technical procedures dictated the creation of maps that depicted topography or construction plans. Maps of Salt Lake City exhibited initial land distributions, the division into voting or ward districts, the placement of buildings or other built features such as public works that really early on surrounded both the temple and Brigham Young's family, and that reflected earlier antecedents in both Nauvoo, as you see in this image, or later I'll show you images from Kirtland as well. The Plat of the City of Zion came with the Mormons to each new place that they built, and was this visual representation of both their journey and what they remembered about their experience of persecution. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints emerged out of the Second Great Awakening, a period of religious ferment, which seized religious authority and distributed it among a general population of believers in personal revelation. The Mormon prophet Joseph Smith delivered a message of the restoration of ancient teachings, of authentic religious ideas and priesthood authority from God. The Mormon city that the saints idealistically called Zion helped critique those social alterations taking place in the world around them. Social disorder changed traditional social structures and moral control mechanisms for the city. Devices initially designed to preserve traditional ways of living rooted in the rural landscape. The narration of the Mormon exodus out of the Midwest describes conflict or persecution that drove them out of Ohio and Missouri, then Illinois and into the West. The Mormon pioneers saw the potential of the West becoming another manifestation of God's kingdom. Like Polo's imagined city, they saw future towns and farm fields fertile with crops ready to sustain a growing population of saints. The settlement process centralized in both the person of Brigham Young and in the church center of Salt Lake City. The Latter-day Saints surveyed and distributed land, planted crops, and dug irrigation ditches, building what they considered to be sacred cities after the model of the Plat of the City of Zion. Ideally and initially, theological ideas shaped space and influenced decisions that they made about the placement of streets, houses, the relationship between community institutions, and the way the city embraced the landscape, which includes the domestic landscape of home. The Plat created an explanatory narrative that wove history, theology, and social life into one. The Plat helped it make sense and constructed meaning. Religious people, from Mircea Eliade in his book, The Sacred and Profane, often attempt to reside as long as possible in a sacred universe, space made over to mirror their sense of a wholly different order. As Eliade says, a reality that does not belong to our world. The paradox between sacred and secular power was articulated in virtually every aspect of life. And I love this image from afar of Nauvoo, where you can see the commerce of the Mississippi River, the homes being built up to the river bank, but then the enterprise of building the temple. And the same would be true in Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City represented the cosmos, the center place of the Mormon world, evidence of what was possible. For Latter-day Saints, the Plat became a sort of memory device that helped them remember a particular past, the past they had in Nauvoo, and imagine a brighter future, as physical lines reflected theological concepts and everyday realities. And the church was central to the lives of the Mormon people. And it was evident by the outlines of the Plat, articulating connections between the past and the present and the future, and materializing commandments that worked like boundaries surrounding insiders and identifying outsiders. Part of the explanatory narrative was about persecution, but it was also about hope and resilience, persistence, and the willingness to try anew. Although Smith used the Plat as a pattern for the building of communities in both Missouri and Illinois, the Saints never built a town that was entirely true to the persecutions of the Plat, including Salt Lake City. Zion, consecration and stewardship or cooperation, community and proximity to one's neighbors, the centrality of religion in the group life were embedded in the details of the Plat. The town square, the orchards and gardens of family homesteads, the irrigation canals that ran parallel to most streets in the city, Together, they formed a discourse about what it meant to be a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and this particular community of Zion. The Plat contained detailed instructions about how Zion should be located, constructed, and lived. Physically, the Plat designed a city with a population capped at 20,000 individuals and covering an area of 640 acres, or the equivalent of a single square mile. It mirrored the township prescribed by the Land Ordinance of 1785 and first laid out in the Northwest Territory. Homes were found on ample-sized lots, usually a half an acre each, on 10-acre blocks in town, with houses uniformly set 25 feet back from the street. And farm buildings were located on the north and south of the city in strips of land that were 330 feet wide and 1 mile long. The land extending beyond them was originally shared farmland, and farmers would populate Zion, and the original Plat had no provision for a commercial zone. Again, private homes and public spheres were separate. As the prototype for the settlement of the region, and conceived first as a sacred city, Salt Lake City was an intentional center place. It communicated a clear, identifiable, tangible, as well as metaphorical nexus of literal ideas about Zion. Rather than aesthetic considerations, regularity or order were premier values represented in the plan. As was true of most frontier towns, according to historian Richard C. Wade, quote, regularity of plan was thought more important than beauty or utility. This version of Zion extended the center in a movement in each direction, from the sacred to the profane in the process, endowing space with new meaning and connection to this essential core idea. Mormons' social interaction with this space and with each other added a third dimension to this montage. Distinctive doctrines such as consecration or cooperation wove a web, a city that mapped ideas about the community and space. And sacred spaces were the spaces of ritual or space interpreted as significant because of its association with religious beliefs or practices. The profane space of the city was that of everyday and secular life. Brigham City and San Bernardino and St. George, I'll show you plat maps of each of them, were examples of cities that duplicated on this model. They used the template of the Plat of the City of Zion as part of the colonization of the Great Basin area. Salt Lake City's central orientation created the point from which everything in the Great Basin evolved. Critical in the formation of identity, meaning, and practice, the establishment of Temple Square and Salt Lake City as the center place had profound significance for the settlement of Utah. The persuasiveness of cardinal imagery in Zion was to extend from the Midwest to the West. And once the Latter-day Saints laid off and built a village, their leaders told the saints to lay off another in the same way, and so fill up the world in these last days, and let every man live in the city, for this is the city of Zion. As soon as the first city reached 20,000 inhabitants, a new one would be needed. And Smith, in his directions in the margins, says, when this square, the center place, is thus laid off and supplied, lay off another in the same way, and so fill up the world in these last days, and let every man live in the city, for this is the city of Zion. Excuse me. Unarguably, the sacred city was legible in the parlance of Kevin Lynch's writing in An Image of the City. In the strict grid oriented to the lines of the compass at the heart of the Plat, the centrality of the temple block, and close coordination of settlement and religious activities. Zion would expand across the continent in a systematic, orderly manner. Each new city would ideally be a perfect semblance of the first. Congruent with immigration into the West and the peopling of the frontier, the settlement of Zion mirrored the American dream and the belief that God chose this land for a special mission. Importantly, it was the responsibility of God's people to settle it, in that the Plat was both theology, church doctrine and teaching, and a vision of the good society. For the Mormon settlers of Salt Lake City, distinctive doctrines such as consecration and cooperation wove a web, a city that mapped ideas in space. And Salt Lake City became a city virtually overnight when wagon trains of Mormon pioneers began to descend into the valley after July 1847. The fact that they were a group, that they had a clear sense of plan, and an influential leader in Brigham Young facilitated the rapid expansion of the area. Church leaders established the basic organizational system of the city as soon as they had chosen the site by dividing it into 19 wards. And those wards were ecclesiastical units, but also organizational units used for the census. The map detailing these ward agreements suggests an argument about life in the city, employing familiar rhetorical devices. The pioneer concept of a ward was a religious idea, as well as a pattern of organizing relationships in Zion. Each ward contained 9 blocks that functioned as a small community and were controlled by a bishop. The saints imposed order on the geography wherever they went. Orthogonality, regularity, and cardinality characterized the way they platted the ground and distributed land. The allocation of land failed to be equal from the first, and church leaders, especially those with large families and plural families, received the largest allotments of land in prime locations. The 12 apostles selected prime lots for their wives, families, and friends, and after the first division of property, they divided the other blocks into units as they saw fit. In towns based on the Plat, buildings ran parallel to the street, and streets met at right angles. Streets radiated out from the Aximundi or the center place, in particular, the southwest corner of Temple Square. What resulted was a hierarchy of spaces with the most sacred religious core at the center and the cooperatively farmed big fields at the periphery. Families lived in town lots according to the Plat of the city of Zion on half-acre lots and traveled a distance to farm together. The Plat spoke to the importance of community, of the coming and living together, thus expressed spatially, clearly delineated on both maps and in life practices. Wide orthogonal streets which meet at right angles imposed order on the earth, define natural landscape forms to gentrify or accommodate the direction to live ordered lives according to God's teachings. As was true of the numbering system centered in Temple Square, views to the temple from family homes throughout the city would have oriented individual members toward the center. Temple Square was not literally at the center of the Plat of Salt Lake City. Still, the centrality of religion in the lives of believers, regardless of where they were working in their fields, picking fruit in their family orchard, or hanging washout to dry on clotheslines, was made concrete through the lines of the city. In Utah, Brigham Young interpreted his understanding of Zion when he built his family kingdom on Block 88 in the center of the city adjacent to Temple Square. With the first distribution of land, Brigham Young secured his family's position at the center of Salt Lake City. Young owned the majority of land around Block 88 and on the block itself. The block immediately east of Temple Square borders South Temple and State Streets. There, he carved out the components of the good life: the complex architecture of plurality, a schoolhouse and outbuildings to supply his large family with food, education, and recreation, and distinctive as the homes of the church president and leader of a territorial government, the Beehive House and Lion House represented an unusual family dynamic and adaptation to a particular way of being together in a family. Salt Lake City depicted Zion with its strong center place, the temple and the tabernacle, its commercial mercantile home store, and commercial structures that lined Main Street. Similarly, Brigham Young's family compound on Block 88 illustrated the core ingredients of a family kingdom. There were houses for his multiple families, other structures designed to ensure their self-sufficiency, and an ambiance that assured them that their lives would be meaningful and safe. Block 88 explains the evolution of the city from its start as a sacred city, the headquarters of a church, to a more secular, cosmopolitan city that valued the arts, public life, and education. Throughout the 19th century, Block 88 has been oriented in physical and metaphorical ways to Temple Square by housing visitors to the temple or for church conferences held at the tabernacle. Both church administration buildings were located on South Temple and Block 88, as were the headquarters of the church's tithing system, the bishop's storehouse. The tithing yards spread messily to the center of the block until the early 20th century. And you can see this sketch that gives you a sense of where they were relative to the Beehive House and the Lion House. I'm going to be showing you a whole bunch of maps today, but this is one that gives you a sense of the property that Brigham Young owned, and see how much of it to the east of Temple Square is dark. So as they distributed land, they definitely enforced the hierarchy that existed in church leadership. The bishop's storehouse and tithing office were the most potent symbols of the Mormon law of consecration and stewardship. Here, devoted members made in-kind contributions ranging from dairy products to farm equipment. Livestock corrals located behind to the north and east became known as the tithing yard. Some members produced tithing in the form of physical labor, and public works projects like the wall that would eventually surround Temple Square or Brigham Young's own home, irrigation canals and road systems, or work on the temple itself gave willing workers plenty to do. Work on the temple that would surround the temple began in 1851. The church built the bishop's storehouse in 1850 on the southwest corner, a two-story structure formed out of adobe bricks, covered with plaster scored to imitate stone. They scored the plaster wall surface, which was relatively simple in comparison to the surrounding buildings, as a way of making it more grand. The symmetrical arrangement of the bishop's storehouse elevations suggest a Greek revival influence, although the building is a simple vernacular structure. Besides the word Deseret store proudly displayed above the entrance, and home manufacturer above that signified Young's mantra about the importance of self-sufficiency. And some men, you see this wall in front of the Lion House and the Beehive House. Many men who came to the Great Basin who didn't have cash needed to work for a period of time on public works project, and this was perhaps the most famous one. They worked on a wall that was originally going to run around the periphery of the entire city and be 21 miles long or 12 feet high, 6 feet thick at the bottom, and then less wide at the top. To the east of the block, the Eagle Gate pronounced arrival at State Street and South Temple. Initially a wood eagle and beehive. This gives you a sense where the bishop's storehouse was. And then at the other end of the block is where Eagle Gate was placed. Initially a wood eagle and beehive designed by Hiram Clausen and put in place in 1859. It was replaced with a new design by Joseph Duncarlos Young in 1891. And I'm trying to show you a number of images that give you a sense of the area, the views of Block 88 and Temple Square from all the way around it. This time the Eagle Gate was covered in copper, and the structure spanned a newly widened street and more grandly presented this symbol to the city. The Eagle Gate and the Bishop's Storehouse served as bookends of the street that held the headquarters of the church and the homes of the church president. And Richard F. Burton described it in early 1860s. He said the gateway was surmounted by a plaster group consisting of huge vulturine eagles perched with wings outspread, neck bend as if snuffling the breeze of carrion from afar, and talons clinging upon a yellow beehive, most uncomfortable and unnatural position for this poor animal. The device is doubtless highly symbolic, emblematic, typical, in fact, everything but appropriate and commonsensical. Here's a great image of the Eagle Gate, of the public wall, and then the beehive itself. So Brigham Young's primary residence was the Beehive House on South Temple, the centerpiece of his family complex. And next door, the Line House housed many of his plural wives and their children. The White House, located east of Block 88 on First Avenue, was where one of his wives lived. And I'm going to show you an image of that in just a second. Another picture, another elevation of the Beehive House. And this is the three of them together. Now, this map at the top, I just want to give a little sidebar explanation. This is a type of a map we call a Sanborn map. And they were done more often than every decade, but what they help us understand is the growth of the city, and in particular the placement of buildings on the blocks. And as we study these, you can see what buildings went up and what buildings went down. You can tell what they were made of. There's a different color and different kinds of cross-hatching that tells you if it's adobe or brick or wood or stone. And they're a really wonderful way of getting a sense of the bigger picture around the block. And I'll be showing you a number of these. So construction began on the Beehive House in 1852 and 1853. The adobe brick walls were completed by fall and the roof completely shingled. By the next spring, the Young family moved into this Georgian-style house, complete with classical Greek revival features, a box cornice, roof parapet, a widow's walk, all reminiscent of homes built in New England. The elaborate plan of the house and its connections to both the president's office and a family store located towards the back mirrored the complexity of Young's personal life and his role in the community. The first floor included the most public spaces, 2 parlors, a family breakfast room, a sewing room, a pantry, and storage rooms. On the second floor, a room with elaborate ceiling molding housed formal parties. And the rear wing, stretched to the north, had a kitchen and dining room for workers on the first level and storage above. For this complex living arrangement to work, members of the family had to be flexible. So Brigham Young's first wife, Mary Ann Angel, and her children were the first to move into the home with Brigham Young. But in 1860, she and her children moved to the White House, which is nearby to the east on First Avenue. And Brigham's other plural wife, Lucy Ann Decker, and her children moved into the president's residence. Lucy's role expanded with the entertaining that went on in that house, which was Brigham's most public residence, and the management of the staff of workers who helped the family in its complicated network of persons. In 1889, the house doubled in size with an addition to the rear, and the spaces of this cluster of homes near the absolute center of the city's system of town blocks, their physical dimensions and materiality, and the visual prominence in positional terms expressed a desired social order and Brigham Young's position in it. These architectural design decisions concerning the structures on Block 88 reinforced the church president's authority, his centrality to the kingdom building enterprise, and his free practice of the principle of plural marriage. Although other church leaders owned more than one lot in the city, this consolidation of prime real estate in the block immediately east of the temple gave Young the chance to build the key components of a family homestead for a plural household. The west elevation of the Line House is the most provocative and suggestive architectural emblem of plurality in Utah Territory. Built in 1854, family members sometimes called the Lion House the Big House, not so much a reference to its total square footage as to the number of family members who lived there. Named for the stone lion that was put in place over the front porch when Young completed and occupied the house in 1855. The Lion House was Gothic Revival in style and consisted of 3 primary levels, including a basement. In terms of architectural types, the Lion House's rooms are more reminiscent of a small hotel than a family home, and included in the basement a large dining room, kitchen, and laundry facilities, and sufficient storage for the enormous amount of milk, fruit, and other foodstuffs required to feed this very large family. The family used one room as a school and met nightly for family prayer in the large parlor or prayer room on the main level. Some childless wives occupied the bedrooms located to the rear of this level, and the top floor, certainly the most intriguing floor, included 20 small rooms, each marked with an exterior on the exterior by a peaked gable window, which were reserved for wives with no children or some of the older children who lived at home and helped at the house. The attic above that was used for storage as well, and behind the building, again, attesting to the complicated family situation and the significant number of family members living in the house, was a 2-story outhouse facility. The number of wives or children who lived in the Lion House at any given time varied considerably. As children grew up or the needs of the wives changed, families moved in or out of the house, and wives who lived elsewhere in the territory or city visited from time to time. You can imagine that it was really, really important that Brigham Young's wives learned to cohabit with each other in the same house or nearby. Those who were sealed to him before they traveled to Utah bonded in winter quarters or formed relationships that connected them throughout their lives. Polygamy put limits on individual privacy and required women to exercise considerable flexibility in their claims for different spaces or homes. Most often moved and at times determined by their husbands rather than their personal preference. And although Brigham Young's family is an extreme example, it highlights spatial issues that would have become magnified because of the demands of plurality. When the Mormons first arrived in Utah Territory, they erected an adobe brick fort just west of the center of the city in Temple Square. And Brigham's wives who crossed the plains the first summer lived in the fort or shared quarters or single rooms with their children, were rarely alone. Nevertheless, Brigham visited them upon occasion, and in fact, some of them became pregnant from those visits. Although none of his wives specifically mentioned in their journals or letters how they made these arrangements, it is clear that the expectation was that they be accessible to welcome his visits and to make whatever accommodations were necessary to make him feel comfortable. The small chambers in the fort were the worst of all possible worlds for cohabitation, but plurality was about procreation and the building of family kingdoms. And making babies was the Lord's work in this way of thinking. Accessibility of both person and space was an essential ingredient. Tom Carter recommends we consider the architecture of polygamy as the architecture of accessibility, which he describes as an architecture that helped make women available to men. An assumption that this was very much of this moment, like the slave plantation or even the company town, ready access to women or slaves. And this single block represents the patriarch in the family, in this case, Brigham Young, and then the access to each of the women who lived in the house. Like the slave plantation or even the company town, ready access to women or slaves or workers was critical to the satisfaction of, in this case, ecclesiastical goals, the fulfillment of both prophecy and religious obligation. And I hope these little diagrams we've done to the sides of these images give you a sense of some of the things we see playing out in terms of the relationships that played out there. I really like this one where it has this central spine, which is the hall in the building. But if Brigham walked down the spine, he could have access to women on both sides of the hall. Just a kind of interesting other way of thinking about it. Once land distribution began and town lots were distributed to the various family heads, including each of the plural wives. And this is a photo of a group of 10 daughters that Brigham Young had in a very short period of time as adults. They were always known as the Big Ten. Zina Diantha Huntington Jacob Smith Young, for one, moved into the old log row, which included 7 or 8 rooms in a row, along with her sister wife, Louisa Beeman, among others. Zina next moved into a small adobe home and then to the Lion House with her daughter with Brigham, Zina Presendia. She conceived and bore Zina Presendia while living with her sister wives in the limited spaces of the log row, as had several other wives and children. The architecture of the Pioneer Fork, the log row, and even Zion's final adobe cabin failed to communicate the language of accessibility through hallways or thresholds or doorways and other mediators. And I think that's what we were trying to get at with this diagram. It's the language of accessibility and other mediators that controlled interaction or conveyed a particular message about who was welcome, who was not. Instead, in this phase of settlement, life practices represented this concept, and it's important in theology and belief. The Mormon doctrine of plurality played out in a patriarchal world where husbands and priesthood holders ruled, but also held ultimate responsibility for the satisfaction of a religious mandate. One can only imagine the complicated life practices of Brigham's life with his 56 wives, although it is possible to find patterns in birth dates and rates. The locations where women lived in St. George, the farmhouse, or in other areas, or when. Brigham spent the most time with women who were in their childbearing years or who had small children. Other women, like Eliza R. Snow and Zina Diantha Young, who had been wives of Joseph Smith, were also important to him as leaders in the women's auxiliary and significant home industry enterprises, many of which played out in the buildings on his family block. An architecture of accessibility interpreted is one that communicates the, quote, right to make use of something particular. But the space embodied in the Mormon temples is exclusionary space, or space accessible only to the most elite. The architecture of accessibility is a built environment that makes it possible for one group to make use of another through a particular place. Those in power have free access to all spaces, whereas those without power or secondary in the ranking have limited access or controlled access to the spaces of either buildings or environments. Access denied or monitored with a series of thresholds, understandings about who can and cannot enter, and when, helped individuals comprehend the parameters of their lives and how they could practice the doctrine of plurality of wives. The incidental result of such limitations on those of secondary status is that it holds them suspended in a ready position, always available or accessible to the male figures in the LDS hierarchy. In Mormon polygamous households, this was true for polygamous women, despite considerable variation in how it played out in everyday life. This is an 1889 Sanborn map of Temple Square. So Joseph Smith first described temple worship in Revelation, but its practice by the Mormon people became central to group identity over time, cementing social relationships, which for them had significance both on the earth and in heaven, and rooted shared understandings of theology in the sacred spaces of temples, an eminently social thing in every way, as Turner said. First in homes, then in Utah and endowed in the endowment houses, sacred ordinances that became temple worship and the sacred spaces of temple interiors were practiced by the Mormons through ritual, performed religious ideas, and held the saints in a liminal space where they could imagine more for their lives than the dusty streets of the frontier city of Salt Lake City. I think this image emphasizes the centrality of the temple, even though it wasn't literally at the center. This is a floor plan of the interior of the Nauvoo temple, and it gives you the sense of the movement through a series of spaces that increased in their sacredness. And then this image is an image that I hope will communicate some sense of hierarchy, which was absolutely critical to interiors of temple. The temple endowment or key ritual involved a series of stages, a performance of a spiritual journey towards salvation. And believers moved through a series of rooms that signified different levels of the Mormon concept of heaven, culminating in the celestial room. First, the individual worshiper was washed and anointed, draped with a robe embroidered with sacred symbols. They were sworn to secrecy because of the sacred nature of the ordinance itself, and then watched as actors performed the story of the creation and fall of man, with Joseph himself in Nauvoo playing the role of God the Father. Passwords, special handshakes and grips, and secret names became a series of thresholds where believers moved from the temporal or secular lives outside of temple walls to this liminal space, which transported them to imagined possibilities. Baptism for the dead and the washing and anointing, as is true in many religious sacred spaces, took on new meaning and significance in the context of temple worship. Ritual and symbolize transformed the temple and differentiated it from the meeting house or church and set it aside from the daily lives of the people. The interior space created by the Mormon temple tested and interpreted accessibility, inclusion or exclusion, or the sacralization process. The temple was exclusive, it was sacred, and it was intended for the use of only the most faithful. It revealed social hierarchies that distinguished between insiders and outsiders, as well as priesthood hierarchies that guaranteed certain conditions in the afterlife for its members. The temple became a sort of challenge to the world outside, a proud claim to truth, access to God, and the boundary around the Mormon vision of heaven and life on the earth. The temple was a sacred landscape where the performance of ideas about heaven and earth drew lines between the most faithful and those without faith. Temple worship played out beyond view, was inaccessible to non-believers, and was available to only the most devoted followers of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. Temple worship included movement through a series of spaces and thresholds, and it was a way of moving from the ideas and experience of life on the earth to another imagined realm of heaven. In this, the temple created what Turner calls liminal space, a realm of pure possibilities. And he says, liminality is not only transition, but also potentiality, not only going to be, but also what may be, or formulable domain in which all that is not manifest in the normal day-to-day operations of social structures, whether on account of social repression or because it is rendered cognitively invisible, can be studied. The space of the Salt Lake Temple was a hierarchical space. Participants moved through this series of experiences in the effort to become suspended from their ordinary lives, to fully commune with God and to share a vision of heaven. In the temple, anything seemed possible and within reach. The experience of the temple was not available to those outside of Mormonism, but reserved for the most faithful. The Mormon concept of the kingdom of God materialized in spaces that brought people together in the community. The Mormon town helped define their relationships with each other, explain their connection with God and heaven, and participated in boundary making and in the interpretation of difference. Ritualized spaces brought people together for lectures or sermons, for spiritual manifestations and sacred ordinances, and the performance of religious identity and idea. These spaces created geometric patterns or gestures which characterize religious belief. Within a decade of Salt Lake City's initial land distribution, and when the Saints erected homes and businesses near the city core, it began to change. It also has been convincingly argued by historian Richard Bushman and others that the pioneers were familiar with what he called the genteel city, or the city of culture and proper society. The genteel city demonstrates civility and the desire to create a good society in physical terms. Not long after settlement, Brigham Young felt the Saints needed a grander setting for theatrical performances. And when completed, the Salt Lake Theater was considered one of the most architecturally significant buildings constructed during his lifetime. Young encouraged his people to be righteous, but also to enjoy themselves. Theater, dance, and music became enticing escapes from the grind of community building. And first in the social hall and then the more elaborate Salt Lake Theater, they joined for cultural life, a welcome counterpoint to the seriousness of living righteous lives. The Salt Lake Theater was located a block south of Brigham Young's Beehive House and was financed in part by sale of surplus goods acquired from Johnson's army when it vacated the territory. It was 80 by 140 feet long and built from adobe and stone and designed by church architect William Folsom. Not long after Brigham Young felt the need for grander theatrical performances, he felt they needed a more grand and important center of government. The center of governmental and other public functions was the Council Hall. Designed by Truman Angell in 1849, this distinctive territorial building originally sat on the southwest corner of South Temple and Main Street. The primary entrance to this two-story, four-square building was on South Temple. Sturdy, unpretentious, and formal, this multi-purpose facility provided the physical location for the organizational meetings of Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institution, the territorial legislature, and the space served as the Deseret News print shop for several years until 1883, when it was destroyed by fire. The LDS Church used the upper room for endowment ceremonies before they built the endowment house on Temple Square and then later the temple. The building was quite simple in conception, 45 feet square, a delicate string course, aesthetically separated and defined the two stories and distinguished the line between the sandstone first level from nearby Red Butte and adobe brick second. Overall, the design was based on square proportions and featured a significant cornice, low-hipped roof, and cupola, all fully in line with the Greek Revival style. Brigham Young's son, Joseph Don Carlos Young, drafted a proposed design of Main Street and South Temple elevations of Block 88 in 1887. His vision included a commercial zone developed along Main Street that was conscious of the centrality of the block and its varied functions to the religious and temporal life of the city. The streetscapes reflected a curious mixture, true to the theocracy that existed at the time, between the sacred and profane vocabularies of distinctive Mormon spatial and social practices. The proposed Philharmonic Hall sits broadly in the center of the block in the plan for public meetings. Still to the north, the Temple Hotel provides easy access to the temple block for travelers intent on attending temple rituals. Immigrants still gathering to Zion could find rest in the hostel, designed for those with less money to stay as they acclimated to the new environment. Reflecting the Victorian rather than the neoclassical style of the next generation of buildings, and moving away from the strict regularity of the Greek Revival buildings of the first generation of structures, the streetscape reveals a turning point turning towards cosmopolitan and sophisticated styles and structures. And this is squarely in the 19th century Mormon church mix of church and contemporary life. Generally, Mormon architectural styles lagged a little bit behind national trends. And then a couple more. The redesign of Block 88's west and south streetscapes illustrates the tension between the old and the new, a yearning towards greater sophistication and style, more like a genteel city than a frontier city of earlier decades. Still an amalgam of the sacred and secular, this proposal nevertheless speaks volumes about where they hope to go next, a city of the imagination like that in Calvino's story. Amelia's Palace, constructed between 1873 and 1881 for a favored wife of Brigham Young in the Second Empire style. And some of you may even remember the Deseret Gym, and I'll show you that as well. After the turn of the century, architecture continued revealing the evolution and maturation of the LDS Church. The Hotel Utah, the LDS Administration Building, and the act of tearing down the remaining remnants of the tithing yard and cooperative world resulted in the performance of a very particular type of religious identity in the worldwide church. The Lion House remains on Block 88 as a quaint curiosity rather than as a centerpiece. The Hotel Utah, built in 1991 and designed by Parkinson and Barnstorm of Salt Lake City and Los Angeles, was neoclassical in style, or an Italian Renaissance modern building made of concrete and steel with a sheath of white matte glazed enameled brick and decorative white matte glazed enameled terracotta. A roof garden found on the concrete roof above 10 stories, 315 hotel rooms provided a view of both Temple Square and Block 88 itself. Hotel Utah had an 88 square lobby and grand mezzanine level balcony. Young and Son architects designed the 1917 LDS Church office building as a steel frame structure, fireproofed with reinforced concrete. The building is 5 stories, sitting on a solid granite base with a dominant projecting plinth of granite and reinforced concrete. Neoclassical in style, 24 Ionic columns surrounded the building, and a prominent entablature, including lions' heads, carved in granite, tops the building. In 1862, the church built the headquarters of the Relief Society, designed by Brigham Young on the site of the LDS Business College, which was in that one image of the Joseph Don Carlos redesign. These are just a number of images that will give you a sense of the environment surrounding it. The Gardo House and the Deseret Gymnasium. And from the opposite direction, and you see the statue of Brigham Young. Completing this suite of self-consciously public buildings is the LDS Church office building, built in 1975 and designed by George Cannon Young, influenced by the work of Corbusier. This welded steel skyscraper moves 28 stories into the sky and has a 3-story parking garage. Entered from the north and the south, the building's dominant central vertical tower is flanked by 2 4-story wings. These prominent wings are adorned with bas-relief sculpture depicting a map of the world, emphasizing that Mormonism had transcended the intense locality of Block 88. The Plat of the City of Zion was a practical device for the colonization of the Great Basin Kingdom. Still, it was also a narrative device that embodied the vision or the dream of the Good Society. At the same time, it was an idea about a city of God. As in Calvino's conversation between Con and Polo, cities are more than material and are inhabited. And they also reside in part in the imagination and are the representation of desires and fears. At once self-conscious and unconscious, cities reveal rationality and emotion that sweeps them towards an uncertain future. The Plat was conceived of as a setting for Zion, a specific set of life practices, and expressed a millennial view. It helped constrain the imagination and consolidate it in tradition and authority. The messages, maps, and images give us about the meaning of Salt Lake City's central spaces reveal a series of paradoxes between the sacred and profane, between the communal and the individual. The lines drawn through space ran deep. Salt Lake City changed in form and meaning and moved from a sacred city to one with genteel character to a commercial city, secular in ways more like other Western cities than different. The original definition inscribed in its central place by the temple, wide streets, the grid plan created a discourse, a sort of point-counterpoint. Salt Lake City was unique among American cities in its explicit orientation to the group, its origin as a religious idea, and its location on a mountain range. The resulting paradoxes that characterized its evolution only served to augment or magnify those original characteristics. Added to the original paradigm were layers traced by generations of newcomers, changed economic and political conditions, the impact of technology, and the spatiality of social life. Block 88 and the city it illuminates is in a way a canvas, not blank, but malleable, a palimpsest that can be erased and altered to create linkages rather than blockages, common ground instead of inclusion. It is a discourse that continues to the present. Thank you very much.